Okay, good morning everyone, and thank you very much for joining our webinar today. My name's Sarah Kendall and I work as a crop physiologist at ADAS, and I'm going to be chairing the meeting today. So the webinar this morning is the last in a series of 3 webinars where we focused on different aspects of nutrient management, and we'll share the links to the recordings for those webinars after the webinar finishes today by email. So you'll be able to catch up on those if you've missed any of those. So today's webinar focuses on optimizing crop nutrition through dynamic planning. So we'll be taking a dive into thinking about why planning's important and thinking about what information we should be making account of when we're creating nutrient management plans. But I think the really important aspect that we want to get across is to think about that plan as a dynamic plan. So not something necessarily that we create at the start of the season, but something that we revisit through the season to make sure it's relevant. If we can move to the next slide, please, Laurie. So before we start, just a few notes from a housekeeping perspective. So the webinar today is being recorded, so if you need to leave before we finish, you'll be able to catch up afterwards. So during the webinar, everyone will be muted and your cameras will be switched off. If you want to ask a question and do that in person, there will be an opportunity to unmute and ask your questions at the end of the technical presentation and during the Q&A. So please raise your hand if you want to be unmuted. If you prefer, feel free to use the chat function if you want to put any questions in there. So we'll address any questions that relates to anything Laurie and I present at the end of our section. And then we'll use questions in the chat during the Q&A as well at the end with Mark and Ian. My colleague Lucy is going to share a link in the chat now to a form where you can share your basis and Naroso points so that we can assign those points to you after the meeting. If we can move on to the next slide. So just to kind of give a bit of a flavour for what we're going to talk about this morning. So we're scheduled to finish by 10:30, but I expect we probably will last between an hour and an hour and a quarter, depending on how many questions we have. So just to kind of set the expectations there. So I'll start by giving a bit of an overview of what we've coined the plan, check and adjust and review steps to nutrient management, and I'll discuss a bit about that approach. And then my colleague Laurie Abel, who is also a crop physiologist at ADAS, will talk through some of the fundamentals of planning. She'll talk about dynamic planning and what information to consider and when. And then I'll follow up with a couple of case study examples that really, I suppose, go into some detail about how we can create a more accurate plan by accounting for additional information. And then the final half of the webinar will focus on a Q&A session, and that's with Farms Director for Strawson Ltd, Ian Holmes, and independent agronomist Mark Taplin. So we're really grateful to Ian and Mark for joining us this morning, particularly to Mark, who's actually in Romania at the moment. So he's made an extra effort to be with us. So I hope that they'll really give a flavour for how they think about planning, what some of the opportunities and challenges are, and to get a feel for the information they consider when they're making their plans. Okay, if we can move on. So I'll just quickly recap the NUTRI-CHECK-NET project and a bit of information about the plan, check and adjust and review approach before we go into thinking about the detail for planning. So if we can move on to the next slide, Laurie. Thank you. So ADAS have been leading for the last 3 years a Europe-wide project which is called NUTRI-CHECK-NET. And I suppose this project has come about from really recognising the urgency to provide better support to farmers and advisors to enable them to optimise the crop nutrition decisions that they make. And to help facilitate those better decisions in the NUTRI-CHECK-NET project, we've developed a framework called 3-step checking, and this focuses on 3 elements. So the first being plan, the second check and adjust, and the third review. And we're going a bit backwards with our series of webinars because I've already mentioned this is the final webinar in a series of 3, but we're actually dealing today with that planning phase. And I think when we were preparing for this, you think, well, creating nutrient management plans is a very standard thing that is done on, most of the farms across the UK. So why should we really be thinking about planning more carefully? And I think it's really important because it brings it back to how do we link planning with these other steps? So how do we link with check and adjust where we're actually thinking about that original plan and considering actually the measurements that we can take in season and how that additional information may feed back into the plan. But we also rarely really think about how can we review the success of that plan. And I think that's very much where that review step comes in. And we've been working at ADAS looking at the value of measuring the nutrients in harvested produce. So we focus largely on grain analysis in our work, but thinking really how can that information reveal how well farms' plans and their adjustments have worked. And I think on most farms, really the success of nutrient applications and the decisions which guide those applications is largely determined by yield. And that's really irrespective of the fact that there are obviously many non-nutritional factors that are affecting yield. So we think nutrient concentrations of harvested produce enable us to understand whether crops have captured insufficient or adequate or excess amounts of each nutrient. And they then enable farmers and advisors to review nutritional performance, to think about soil nutrient balances carefully, and also consider the efficiencies of the nutrient applications. And in this diagram on the screen, you can see it's a circle, and that's because we very much think of this from a kind of circular perspective. So each of these steps feeding into the next step and really using the information that's been gathered to think about how can we make improvements from a nutrient management perspective when we move into the next season. So it's very much about having that plan being dynamic, making adjustments, getting to the end of the cropping season and reviewing, and that information feeding into the next stage of planning. We can move to the next slide, Laurie. And if you've joined some of our other webinars, you'll have seen this image before, but this is really to just think about what's our standard approach to managing crop nutrition and where can we make improvements. And of course, typically, the measurements that most farms will be making are doing soil analyses for major nutrients and pH every 3 to 5 years. But actually, we know that there's such a lot of uncertainty that then falls in terms of we've got different weather conditions and different seasons, we're growing different crops, and to only actually have that information every 3 to 5 years, I think creates a lot of questions that we don't have answers to. So there's the potential to really supplement that soil analysis that's done as the, I suppose, cornerstone of thinking about nutrient management with additional information. And on some farms and for some crops, that might include using leaf analysis, where we've got specific questions that we want to address, or it may be used as a tool to help refine some of the nutrient applications that we're making in season. And then we can also supplement soil analysis by using grain analysis or measuring the nutrient concentrations in the produce or the kind of crop that's been taken off the field, and actually moving towards that annual field by field post-mortem can be a really useful step in trying to have more intelligence about nutrient uptake and nutrient offtakes and how that can then feed into next year's plan. So I think hopefully that's kind of highlighted a bit of the concept for NUTRI-CHECK and why we're doing this webinar to talk about planning today. I also just wanted to signpost, so part of the NUTRI-CHECK-NET project has been to create an inventory of tools and analyses and different solutions that are available to farmers across Europe to help them with those decisions that they make around nutrient management. And there's a subset of the tools within the inventory that focus on this planning step that we're discussing today. So we have a custom platform that's been built for NUTRI-CHECK-NET, and if you Google that, you'll be able to find it. And again, we'll send links to some of these resources after the webinar. But yeah, I urge you to kind of take a look at that, because there's some interesting tools that are both available here but across Europe. So the information's quite insightful on there. So at this point, I'll hand over to my colleague Laurie. So she's going to now kind of talk in a bit more detail about dynamic planning and the fundamentals of planning. So I'll hand over to you, Laurie.
Hi, everyone. As Sarah said, I'm part of the crop physiology group with ADAS. So yeah, I'll talk through what information we need as well for dynamic planning. So we'll start off about why planning is important. So nutrient management planning covers both agronomic and compliance requirements to ensure optimal rates of fertiliser, match crop demand and losses are minimised. So planning is crucial for purchasing the correct amount of fertiliser and ensuring fertilisers are neither under or over applied. So we'll look at the we'll look at the 4 key components of planning. So as I said, soil testing every 3 to 5 years, calculating your crop nutrition requirements, and calculating your nutrient levels from organic manures and the amount of fertiliser required, including your product and rate. So we have got 2 polls coming up next. The next 2. So we've got the first one, if you could pick one answer for this one. So it is, when do you make your initial nutrient management plan for N? So we've got in the summer, in the autumn and in the spring. So if you could, that'll pop up on the screen just now. If you'd all select just one answer for this one, please. I'll give you a couple of minutes to answer. And Sarah should be able to see the results as well.
Yeah, I can. Yeah. Yeah, so Laurie, what we've got is 52% of the respondents saying that they make that initial plan in the summer to enable fertiliser requirements to be calculated and purchases made. A small number of responses for in the autumn once those winter crops have been drilled, and then 33% are saying that their initial plan is made in the spring so that they can be more accurate with requirements. And I guess that kind of leads into, doesn't it, thinking about what we need for an initial plan, but the fact that that initial plan maybe isn't actually the plan that really characterises what we actually apply on a field by field basis.
Perfect. Right, we'll move on to our second one. So the second one is about our amendments made to this initial plan. So we've got, do you make amendments to your initial nutrient management plan? We've got yes at several points in the season, yes, but only once or twice, and no, I stick with the initial plan.
Yeah, so for this, the kind of most popular responses are sitting between yes at several points in the season and then yes, but only once or twice. So very few people actually talking about the fact that they make that initial plan and just stick to it. So that's really good to see. And I think one of the things we acknowledge is that making changes to the plan takes time. So it's really important, I think, to prioritise what's the additional information that's important to you as a farm, and making sure that you prioritise making changes on that basis. So I think it's very much a farm specific approach here.
Perfect. Now we've asked you about your nutrient management plans, and we'll move on to our we'll go through the first step of nutrient management planning. So this kind of looks at the farm as a whole. So your initial plan for many farms could be based on how much fertiliser you maybe have previously used. So this is quite high level planning. So you look at your crop demand and your overall objectives. Again, look at your soil analysis and consider your rotations in previous crops. You also make considerations for fertiliser choice, so taking into account your nutrient form, your crop uptake, so align your product timing with growth stages, environmental conditions, so your risk of bleaching or runoff, and product availability, storage application equipment, and your economics. So there can often be compromises needed. There needs to be a balance between your crop demand and under applying your fertiliser as well. And then we'll move on to your second step. So this takes a look at the initial farm plan you made in the first step and takes a step deeper into a field by field basis. So this looks at your soil indices, your previous crop, average rainfall, your S&S index. Some field situations are better suited to one particular estimation method. For example, the measurement method is often more appropriate where the SNS is likely to be quite high, and with fields with history of organic manure applications as well. And you look at the market and your expected yield. And in this step also, you look at your nutrient requirements and your nutrients that are provided by your organic and inorganic materials. So yeah, this is looking more in depth at your field by field basis and kind of refining it from the first step. And then we'll move on to going into the third step. So we take the crop nutrition requirements that were calculated in your second step and refine these figures with nutrient analysis. So you can do this through grain analysis, manure and organic material analysis, and your SMN. So standard values are useful, but specific measurements are more reliable and supports your dynamic planning by integrating your results into the plan and refining your calculations that you maybe previously made earlier in the year. So round that off, saying a tailored fertiliser plan aligned to your actual offtakes, which you get from your analysis, will help reduce waste and improve your efficiency overall. So talking about refining your nutrient plan, we've got our third poll. So this will look at how often you base your amendments. What do you most often base your amendments to your nutrient management plan on? So we have 6 answers here. So we've got soil analysis, results, crop performance and yield observations, weather conditions, manure organic material analysis, grain or tissue nutrient analysis, and your fertiliser prices, your product availability. So if you could choose for this poll your top 3, so your top 3 that you'd base your amendments on, please, that would be great. I'll give you a couple of minutes to answer.
Just still going up, so I'm just waiting till it appears to plateau. Okay, so in terms of from those 6 choices, we've got the joint most popular answer is soil analysis result and crop performance and yield observations. And then we move down to manure and organic material analysis. So 15% of people selected that as one of the options. Then we've got weather conditions and grain or tissue nutrient analysis. And then the most unpopular choice was fertiliser prices and product availability. So yeah, I guess some consistency there, and maybe as expected in terms of soil analysis and crop performance coming out on top.
Perfect. Right. So going from that, we'll move on to our P&K planning. So when planning phosphate and potash use, the first decision is to agree on your overall strategy. So are we aiming to build up soil indices, maintain them, or are we comfortable to run them down in the short term? We need to look back across your rotation. So if there's been any surplus or deficit of phosphate or potash applied to your earlier crops, we must account for them in planning for the current crop. The key calculation is to work out how much phosphate and potash will actually be removed in the harvested crop. So this depends on your targeted yield. The higher the yield, the more nutrients will be removed. So that figure gives us the replacement requirement to maintain the soil at its present index. And importantly, it's not just the grain we need to think about. Nutrients are also moved in the straw, which can be significant, especially in dry seasons like the one we've just had. And many of you will be familiar with this table here. So this is taken from RB209. So as you can see, the typical values of potash and crops is provided in this column here. And this allows you to make more accurate applications based on your yield. For wheat, you can see the top row here. There's a row for grain only, and grain and straw. So dependent if you're baled or chopped your straw as well. So it is important to use tables like this to refine your P&K in your planning stages. So here we highlight the importance of your check and review in your planning stages. So these graphs here, these are based on our yen crops from 2013 to 2021. And they show the distribution of NP and K across 1,700 crops within the yen. So you can see the variation between the crops, and the nutrient concentrations vary a lot. And here the red lines are your typical values from your RB209. So you can see that the nitrogen, excuse me, the nitrogen graph has less variation, and the standard values are quite in line with the yen average values. So again, these red lines are from RB209. Whilst for the potassium, you can see that the standard RB209 values are quite far off the yen average values here. So could have been exaggerating offtakes for quite some time, especially for your P and K, by relying on your standard value tables in RB209. So this graph here shows the importance and the value of taking measurements of your nutrients throughout the season. For example, in a year you were lower concentrations, you could be over applying nutrients based on the typical values. There are a few services that can help with your nutrient checking post-harvest. So Yen Nutrition, for example, is offered by ADAS. That calculates offtakes and benchmarking. And grain analysis is also available through a selection of labs as well. So we have just looked at how grain concentrations can vary from farm to farm and season to season. Dry conditions also change how much potash is removed in the straw, particularly relevant this year. So drier seasons often result in higher potash retained, and due to this, the offtake tables, like those found in the Nutrient Management Guide, can be useful. It can be a useful guide for average situations, but in extremes, having a first-hand data will always be more beneficial. And based on these effects, there can be some planning implications. So the use of bale yield measurements may be more specific. Elevated K removal means that you may have to adjust your fertiliser plan. And again, testing can help your future planning. And there are tools such as the PDA nutrient calculator that can help to do this. So this calculator helps with your nutrient removal costs from bale straw. So this can help inform your planning as well, feeding into that dynamic planning. So just as weather affects your nutrient offtakes, the nutrient content of your organic materials isn't fixed either. So knowing what's in them is key for good planning. You should plan to utilise as much as possible the nutrient content of your organic material. So this is a key step in your nutrient planning. Not correctly allowing for these nutrients in your organic material, particularly nitrogen, can result in your unnecessary fertiliser use, but also can reduce your crop yield and quality. So the nutrient content of livestock manures will depend on a number of factors, including type of livestock, the diet and your feeding system, the volume of rainwater entering storage facilities, and the amount of bedding used as well. Consequently, the nutrient content for manures produced on any particular farm may vary significantly from the typical values found in tables. Talking about your nutrient content. So when it comes to organic manures and slurries, your RB209 gives us some really useful typical figures for nutrients like your nitrogen, phosphate, potash, magnesium. But the key point is that these figures are only averages. So the actual nutrient content on your farm can be very different depending on the source, that the way the material has been stored as well, and how it's handled. So that's why lab analysis is recommended. A good analysis will give you values for your dry matter, your total N, your ammonium N, etc. So for poultry manures as well, it will also measure your uric acid, nitrogen. To get reliable results, you need to take a representative sample. So this is very important. And for liquids, that means taking 5 separate 2-litre subsamples and mixing them together and sending that off. And for solid manures, you should take 10 1 kilogram subsamples from different points in the heap or the store and mix them together thoroughly, and then take a sample from that. Doing this properly means you'll have a much more accurate figure from your for your nutrient planning, instead of relying on averages that may not reflect the material that you have. Continue with slurry. So this slide demonstrates why there is real value in analysing your organic materials. You can see here that we've got the dry matter on the x-axis and total N here. And you can also see in the top right corner that we've got the table from RB209. So here we've got 3, for cattle slurry anyway, we've got 3 dry matter percentages, 2, 6 and 10. And this graph here shows at 6, so we'll take 6% example, you've got 6% here, and the dry matter, the total N range is from 1.2 to 4.5. So whereas the RB209 for 6% is 2.6. So if your material has got 4 kilograms, you could be significantly different from the typical values at 2.6. So yeah, it just highlights that underestimating your N may result in over application of possible inorganic N. So that would increase your cost overall. So yeah, this just highlights it's very important to measure your slurry nutrient contents. So what you're applying is specific to your farm. So that if checking the nutrients in your slurry is essential, the next question is, how do we keep our plants flexible as conditions of these changes? So that's where dynamic planning tools come in. So there are several software packages that offer nutrient modules that are that utilize the RB209 recommendations. So these are Planet and Manor NPK. So Planet is a nutrient management decision support tool. So these are for use for farmers and advisors. So these assess and demonstrate demonstrating compliance with the NVZ rules. And Planet has a balance feature which enables surpluses or deficits to roll forward. And Manor NPK is a software tool that provides quick estimates of crop available N, P and K supply from applications of your organic manure. ADAS is currently leading a DEFRA funded project to update these. So Planner and Manor will be updated in the future. So this is to end this section. I'm going to highlight that ensuring your plan is updated in response to relevant changes and in response to your checking and your analysis is a critical step in your planning. So yeah, I will now pass on to Sarah to go through some case studies.
Thanks, Laurie. Yeah, so I just wanted to, I suppose, take what Laurie summarised and put that into a bit of context to try and explain how some of this information could be utilised on farm. So yeah, I've just got an example with a hypothetical farm here. So a farm in the east of England growing feed wheat. It's got historic organic manure use, medium soil type, and it's a second wheat. And in this table that you can see on the screen, I've essentially kind of given two options for how you could think about planning for the nitrogen requirements in this case. So option one essentially is using the field assessment method to determine what the soil nitrogen supply is. So by using the location and estimated excess winter rainfall along with the previous crop and the soil type, we can infer that it's an index 1 and the nitrogen requirement would be 220 kilos of nitrogen. In this example, so I'm not taking account of any additional information, I suppose, that can help to further refine that initial plan. Excuse me. So you can see that we essentially stick with that RB209 recommendation of 220 kilos. So I think probably, on a lot of farms, we'll be using the lookup tables to get to that number. The second option, I suppose, describes a situation in which you're taking further account of additional information that could be available to you. So where we've got estimating the SNS index here. So I said that this farm had a historic organic manure use. So in this example, they've decided to actually use a soil mineral N test to get a better understanding and be clear on what the nitrogen provision from the soil is. And actually the result from that is suggesting that the supply is greater than the field assessment method had suggested. So the SNS index is 2. So that reduces the nitrogen requirement to 190 kilos. And then I've also just included some other areas that could be considered. So the first is asking that question. So is the yield that I'm expecting to achieve with this crop 8 tonnes a hectare, which is what those standard lookup tables reflect for winter wheat, or is it greater or is it less? So in this case, if we say that the farm is targeting and expects to achieve a yield of 9.5 tonnes per hectare, then we need to account for this by increasing the nitrogen. So an additional 10 kilos of N per half tonne hectare over 8 tonnes a hectare. So that would result in an additional 30 kilos required. And then I've put another step here, and that's really thinking about if on a farm you've been measuring grain nitrogen or protein over a number of years, and it's perhaps apparent that actually those grain nitrogen results are consistently higher than the 1.9% that would be characteristic of getting that nitrogen provision right and kind of meeting that crop end demand. So in this case, the farm's got evidence actually that grain nitrogens are coming in nearer 2%, and that's perhaps something that they've seen over a couple of years and maybe across a few different fields. So there's an evidence base there that potentially the nitrogen has been over applied in the past. So the recommendation in RB209 is that kind of for each 0.1% grain N over 1.9, you can then make a reduction in 30 kilos of nitrogen. And obviously that approach would be different from a milling wheat perspective where you're targeting higher proteins. Obviously on some farms, there may not be a willingness to actually just roll that out across, a whole farm. So it may be that making that reduction on the basis of having high grain nitrogens, that's something to actually just try on a field or a couple of fields, or probably even better would be to make the reduction on several tram lines in a field and actually determine, was there an impact? So did the grain nitrogen come down and was it closer to 1.9%? But anyway, in that situation, you could make that 30 kilo reduction. So that would actually mean that the increase for yield, but then the decrease to get to nearer 1.9% would equal themselves out. So in this case, you would therefore have a situation where you would apply 190 kilos of nitrogen. So I suppose the message here is that accounting for the additional data would result in a £34 a hectare saving over using option 1. If you can move to the next slide, Laurie. Yeah, so same farm setup here, but now we're thinking about P&K requirements. So again, 2 sections to the table describing different options. So firstly thinking about, determining the requirements. So in this case, we've got soil results indicating an index 2 for P and an index 1 for K. So we've therefore got the requirements of 55 kilos of phosphate and 75 kilos of potash. Laurie's already described the need to account for additional offtakes through greater yields, and also to account for the balance of nutrients from previous applications. So in this top option, essentially, we're not really accounting for those at all. So we're essentially looking at what's the crop's requirement, and that would be the amount that needs to be supplied to that crop through either inorganic or organic fertilizers. In the second option, we start to take account of some of these things. So that is by thinking about that increased yield. So if the yield is going to be 9.5 tonnes per hectare rather than 8, then we need to account for the additional P&K that would be taken off through offtakes. So in this case, if we're not baling the straw, then that would be 6.5 kilos for phosphate and 5.5 kilos for potash. So we can make those amendments and account for those additional offtakes in terms of nutrients that would need to be provided. And then the final row here is actually to think about what nutrients has already been delivered previously and whether there's a carryover of those nutrients. So in this example, digested sewage sludge was applied to the previous crop. And actually, because the soil is index 2, we have accounted for the total amount of phosphate in that sewage sludge. So if we remove the offtake of the previous crop, that leaves a balance. And what that balance means is that actually we don't need to apply any phosphate to this crop of wheat because the supply should be great enough. But there is no balance from a potash perspective. So in that case, we need to obviously meet the requirement, and we've actually increased the requirement to account for that additional offtake. So in this case, there would be no need to apply additional phosphate, but 83 kilos of potash would be required. So the saving from going down an option 2 route rather than option 1 in this case is £58 a hectare due to the saving from the phosphate, but there's actually a slightly greater cost incurred with the potash. So I think the message here is that there's lots of additional information that you could take account of, and we do recognise that this all requires time, and a lot of time if you want to be particularly accurate with estimating offtakes and calculating balances. But I think from a cost perspective and an environmental perspective, trying to be as accurate as possible with these estimations of fertiliser requirements is really important now and probably going to become increasingly important. So I think, if you're a farmer or advisor listening to this, it's really trying to strategically think about on your farm or the farms you advise on, what is the additional information that could really strengthen the plan, and to remember to keep that plan dynamic as the season progresses. If you could just move to my final slide, Laurie. So just kind of following on from that, many of you will probably be already aware of this, but AHDB have recently released a new organic materials value calculator, which is a very simple tool. And actually, further down the information for this, it does say it's not a nutrient management planning tool, but I think it is useful in making sure that we can consider the value that organic materials are providing, both from a nutrient provision perspective, but also in terms of monetary terms as well. So the tool's simple, and you just input some basic information about the material, the rate it'll be applied and when it'll be applied, and that gives useful information about the value based on up-to-date fertiliser prices. So I thought it was just useful to signpost to that. So that brings us to an end, kind of going through some of that technical information. So yeah, just to summarise some of the things that we've covered. So planning is obviously vital to maximise profitability and to minimise environmental damage. Plans really need to be dynamic and amended through the season. And those amendments to the plan can be made for estimated yield, seasonal conditions, data and measurements. So that might be manure analysis or SMN analysis where that's relevant. And by measuring nutrients in the grain, or it could also be in forage as well, you've got that ability to make a more accurate understanding of what the offtakes are, and deficiencies can also be highlighted to inform future strategies and planning. And just a kind of reminder that if you've got grain that was harvested this season, it's not too late for that post-harvest analysis. So yeah, we offer Yen Nutrition through ADAS, but obviously the labs have got their grain analysis services available too. So yeah, I really urge you to explore those options. And yes, even if you've kind of got a bulked sample, I think that can still give you some useful information in terms of where you are sitting with those nutrient levels. So that brings to a close the first part of the webinar. So we're going to move on now to kind of really get first-hand experience now. And Ian and Mark are going to join me for a Q&A discussion. I've not seen any questions come in on the chat. If you do have any questions that link to anything that Laurie and I have talked through, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we can potentially cover those during the discussion, or we can always respond to those in the chat or get back to you afterwards as well. So feel free to put any questions that you've got into the chat. And yes, so thanks very much to Ian and Mark for joining me. It's really great to have you involved in this discussion, because both of you have been involved in the NUTRI-CHECK-NET project. So Ian's been involved in a crop nutrition club that we held in Nottinghamshire, and Mark's been involved in a club that we held further in the west, where we worked as a group with farmers advisors to try and look at different tools that can support decision making around the plan, check and adjust, and review stages of nutrient management. But I think to kick off the discussion, it would be really good if you could just both give a bit of an introduction to yourselves and to talk about kind of the farm or the farms that you're advising on, and maybe just give some indication in terms of, you know, your interests in trying to optimize nutrition in your areas. So Ian, if you wanted to go first, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Morning, everybody. So yeah, my name's Ian Holmes. I'm Farm Technical Director for the Strawson Ltd business. We're a family farming company based in Nottinghamshire, but farm in total about 15,000 acres, including East Anglia, Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire, Shropshire, and grow carrots in Scotland as well. So we're farming on quite a range of different soil types and quite a range of different crops as well. So the business grows carrots, parsnips and potatoes, carrots and parsnips for the retail sector, and potatoes for the crisping market, and then a range of arable crops on a proportion of owned, rented and contract farmed land. So and those soil types range from blowaway sand to Kuiper marl clay. So from a nutrient management point of view or a nutrient planning point of view, then it's quite, you know, it's a hugely important step in what we do in terms of our planning for the crops that we grow. So I think a lot of what's been discussed this morning is really crucial in terms of the way we plan our crop management, and try and optimise the performance of our crops. We're using a range of organic manures within the system as well, less so on the land where we're utilising root vegetable crops because of potential you know, issues there, but certainly on arable land and land for potatoes, and we're using a range of different organic manure sources. And again, the importance of understanding those at the beginning of the application process, and using the results and the analysis of those to be able to determine how we manage our nutrition off the back of that is really important.
Thanks a lot, Ian. And Mark, if you could just introduce yourself and talk about, you know, some of the farms and maybe the diversity of farms that you're advising on.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much, Sarah. Good morning, everybody. Yes, I'm Mark Taplin. I work with my colleague Graham Ditty in Harvest Agronomy Limited in the Midlands and West, working with mainly arable farms, some mixed farms, but mostly arable farms. Manures are an important part of the mix in terms of crop nutrition. We're growing all the broadacre arable crops and forage crops, potatoes and beet. And yeah, just really understanding that detail of how we can refine the nutrition of those crops and make best use of some of the organic amendments we're incorporating, and actually try and get a greater degree of precision in the management of nitrogen and phosphorus in particular, but other nutrients as well. And sometimes I do wonder if we're striving for a bit too much precision when you factor in all the variables that we're dealing with soils and climate. But nevertheless, that's what we've been looking at in the project. And you know, it's been useful to look at some of the tools, tissue analysis, sap analysis, SMN, which we've done bits of over the years, but probably dropped away from it a little bit. But that proved interesting. Gave us some interesting numbers in the project. So just really trying to assess those tools and see which ones are the most useful going forward for the check and adjust part of the program. The grain analysis has been very revealing as well, and it makes you ask questions about why that variability might exist, why it doesn't always necessarily correspond to soil results, and what other factors might be important there. Okay.
Thanks, Mark. I mean, obviously we've been talking about planning today, and I think when you start kind of at a basic level, creating a kind of nutrient management plan doesn't sound complex. And I'm not saying it needs to be overly complicated, but yeah, I suppose it would be interesting just to get a feel from both of you around how straightforward are those initial plans that you make, and what you consider to be the really important information for maybe getting that initial understanding of how much fertiliser a farm needs to purchase and trying to manage that at an initial phase. I don't know if you want to comment first, Ian.
Yeah, so I think the initial plan, from my perspective, is probably this more straightforward bit, and then the complications follow on from that, really. So there's as well as the sort of technical decision making around how that plan should look. So what does the cropping plan look like? What's the expected level of, let's take nitrogen as the example, what's the expected level of nitrogen requirement per field or per crop within that cropping plan, and therefore what's the purchase requirement for the nutrient at the initial stages. That bit's probably relatively straightforward.
Yeah.
It's then the complications of what are we doing with organic materials in the meantime, in terms of the purchase, where's the best time period, and where what's the best format to purchase the product in, probably has a bit of an impact. That we largely on the arable side of things particularly, we're basically using a liquid system, and so we generally commit to trying to get the tanks filled in the autumn so that we know we've got that product there ready to go. I'm a big fan of early application of nitrogen in the spring to build biomass in crops, so I like to have the product there ready to go early on in the spring, and then it's really around sort of tweaking those later applications. We know, for example, in wheat that there's a base level of nitrogen that's needed to grow the crop, in inverted commas, and then it's about tweaking the final requirement based on what the expectation is around yield performance, and obviously what the historic yield performance of the crop's been on that farm or that field previously. So I think the initial planning is probably relatively straightforward, and then it's all the tweaks that happen after that start to complicate it.
Mark, have you got comments on those? I mean, I'm imagining for the farms that you advise on, you may have a variation of roles in terms of your inputs into the planning phase. But yeah, do you have any thoughts in terms of that complexity of that initial plan and when that initial plan happens and how that varies?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that initial plan, which often is late summer, autumn, to guide purchases and things, is very much a headline sort of figure. I mean, within the project we were looking at winter cereals, maize and potatoes, so a lot of those crops might not even be in the ground at that point. So yeah. all those things can change anyway. So it's very much a headline figure, which, as Ian said, you then keep over time. You add more detail to the plan, and it tweaks it in different directions, maybe up, maybe down, depending on what's going on. But very similar, really. But I think the thrust of it is it has to be an active plan. It's a dynamic plan, as you've said before. So you start with a base level, and then you make adjustments as you go along as they're required. And it's really having the confidence, I suppose, to make those adjustments. I mean, I think there's a tendency with documents like 209 to just look at the headline values and perhaps just work on those, at least initially. It's just if you look more into the detail, there's good reasons why you might want to make adjustments to those values.
Yeah, in the chat we've got a comment around making sure that all applications in nutrients are based on yearly historical yield data and soil analyses from a compliance perspective. And obviously we need to make sure that we're taking account of the right information to be compliant. But I suppose if we think about that yield data and thinking about when you're estimating what the potential could be, do either of you have any comments about your approach to that? So, and maybe how much tweaking do you do when it comes to thinking about, what's the potential of this crop? If we're talking about winter wheat, for example, once we get into after Christmas and you're starting to think more about kind of top dressing in the spring, how that kind of the current conditions and looking at the crop, how that maybe influences thoughts about rates? Ian, I'll go to you.
That's all right. There's a combination, isn't there, of what's happened previously and what your expectation or prediction is of what's going to happen going forwards. And so I think clearly a trend of yield over time, I think, is probably the important thing to take. Taking any solo year individually to make that plan can be quite, or could be quite dangerous. If I plan my nitrogen for next year based on our yields from this year, then I'm probably going to have a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy for 2026. We've had a very tricky year in terms of nitrogen uptake with dry conditions throughout the spring, and so I think there's definitely a role for both looking back and looking forward in that process of trying to target nitrogen to yield expectation based on soil type, soil analysis, variety, and likely field performance based on historic knowledge of that field.
Yeah, thanks. With Jim Carswell's asked a question which is interesting, and I suppose this also links a bit to thinking about how price influences approach. And it was interesting when we did that poll that obviously fertiliser price wasn't one of the most popular choices in terms of what's influencing any amendments that you make to the plan. But yeah, Jim's question is about the introduction of the carbon tax in January 2027, where obviously there'll be a tax on imported fertilisers. So how that might affect planning. Mark, I don't know if you've got any thoughts about this, or whether you want to also comment on, the impact of pricing and whether on the whole we're taking account of that, or whether it's only when there's significant increases in prices that we're really looking at that in detail.
Yeah, okay. I think, when we experienced that huge inflation in nitrogen a few years ago, it doesn't alter the optimum nitrogen for the crop, but it then overlays an economic decision based on the value of the crop, the value of the nitrogen. So you kind of, in a way, you end up doing both calculations. You still do the optimum nitrogen for the crop, but then you overlay then the ratio between the value and the cost of the nitrogen. So I think till you know the details. Yeah, your optimum nitrogen doesn't change, but your economic optimum will change as is the play.
Mark, we can't hear you that well. I don't know whether if you can just be a bit. I think it's just if you can speak up or be a bit nearer to the phone, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, we got an electrical storm here at the moment. So yeah, your optimum per yield is one calculation, which you still have to do. Then economic optimum based on carbon tax, nitrogen price, crop value, etc. I'm just going back to the point Ian was talking about with looking at yields, historic and anticipated yields. I mean, we certainly the drilling conditions autumn 24. We didn't factor in necessarily the crop condition in late winter, early spring 25 as much as we perhaps could have done on winter wheat. We had some grain nitrogen. The grain analysis showed that up. We had excess nitrogen on lower yielding crops where we've got compromised soil structures. To try and make an assessment of soil structure and rooting in the spring, would be an important additional factor, but you'd have to be quite bold and quite brave to then make adjustments to your nitrogen plan based on that. But it's real, it does exist, and it needs factoring in.
Thanks, Mark.
Is that any clearer? Or Is that
Yeah,
clearer?
yes, it is. Yes, thank you. Yeah. Ian, any comments from you on the carbon tax, how that might impact decisions that you make?
Yeah, I have. I think I'll just pick up on Mark's last point actually, because that I think that's one of the areas that would really help future planning. You know, whether there's technology that can help to develop that understanding of what nitrogen has already been taken up by the crop in the spring. And I know there are systems out there and have been for some time that can sort of help measure chlorophyll levels, can help to provide some guidance around nitrogen uptake into the crop, but understanding what potential there is through soil structure, through rooting, etc., to understand how much nitrogen the crop is likely to be able to take up going forward. It would definitely be really interesting to see some developments in technology in that area, I think, and that is an area that would really help, I think, to refine our nitrogen applications much more closely to crop potential and what might happen from there and in. And of course, the other area is obviously weather forecasting as well, which if somebody could get us a weather forecast that could actually tell us what's going to happen, then that would be helpful as well.
Indeed.
The piece around the carbon tax is an interesting question, Jim, and I think I'm not sure whether you're thinking more around the potential purchase timing of nitrogen and around when the tax is likely to be incoming. Clearly, there are quite significant cash flow implications around the purchase timing of nitrogen as well. So I think from a purchasing point of view, I think we just have to be aware of what is incoming with the carbon tax and the implications of that going forward, and how we might try and manage or mitigate that. But there are challenges around, around cash flow and the way that works in terms of purchasing for nitrogen in that situation. I think from a technical point of view, I don't think that the carbon tax is going to really alter our view of what we aim to do with our management of crops. So as Mark's already talked about, the difference between optimum nitrogen rate for yield and optimum economic nitrogen rate, the calculation of those two things will still be important, but I don't think fundamentally it will change our approach to nitrogen management, the fact that there's a carbon tax looming going forward.
Thanks. I'm going to pick up on another question from Tony Wade. So he's making the comment that many of the things we've discussed are probably all kind of quite traditional ways still of thinking and accounting for nutrient inputs, which is a valid comment. And he's highlighted about the fact that many people are using newer technologies such as endophyte seed treatments or applications, multi-nutrient foliar feeds, or products that encourage soil biology to increase nutrient availability. So to extent moving into some of those more innovative technologies, and kind of asked to make decision support truly dynamic, are there any plans for these to be incorporated into tools? I'll elaborate and extend that question. I mean, that goes into probably this area of how digital tools can help with the area of kind of making these plans. So I don't know whether you would like to comment on, I suppose, what software or tools you're using to create nutrient management plans, and I suppose what the opportunity is for those tools to actually support you in maybe taking account of additional information that you would do more of if the tools could easily support you in doing so. So Ian, maybe if I start with you.
Oh yeah, thanks for that. I'm just reading that question because there's some really interesting bits in that, and I guess part of the challenge, I guess, around trying to incorporate some of those newer technologies into tools is understanding exactly what they deliver in terms of their unlocking of nutrition or their contribution to nutrient availability to the plant. And I guess we're still in the early stages in some cases of understanding some of those technologies and how and what they provide in terms of their contribution to the crop. So I guess at the moment it's quite difficult to potentially incorporate those into sort of decision-making tools for nutrition management at the moment without having confidence that you're providing the right information into the tool to get the right information back out of it again. And I guess we've always had that with organic manures anyway, because however well you sample an organic manure heap, there's going to be some variation across that heap, and knowing what you're supplying from an organic manure across a field to every part of that field is quite difficult to understand. So I think when you're looking at these more biological type approaches, they're obviously much more driven by conditions. They're much more specific potentially in the way that they work, and so understanding how that really is impacting across the crop and what contribution you're getting, I think is going to be really important to understand those going forward, and what contribution we're actually getting from some of those types of treatments. In terms of the technologies, I think probably what I've referred to already a little bit in terms of, I think, that there has and is some good technology out there now in terms of understanding where crops are up to, what nitrogen levels been taken up into the crop, but understanding better the potential for that crop and what it's got potential to both mobilize and uptake through the remainder of its growing cycle in the spring. That's where I think there's real opportunity for technology going forward, to understand rooting better, to understand soil structure better, and to understand, well, actually, if the conditions are X, this is the likely uptake of nitrogen that you are likely to achieve with this crop through the remainder of its growing cycle. I think that more understanding around that and more technology around that definitely, will definitely benefit. I think we're focusing, I guess, mostly on nitrogen from this point of view, but yeah, I think that will definitely be an area that I would like to see development in going forward.
Mark, any comments from you in terms of software that you use to actually create nutrient management plans, and kind of what you would like to see in terms of developments that would support taking that forward more?
Well, basically, all the types of software that have been referred to previously. I mean, it could be something as simple as just an Excel spreadsheet for a farm, or it could be Planet or Manna or Gatekeeper, nutrient management, those things. I mean, some of the software tends to appear to be quite complicated and quite involved, especially when you print reports off. But actually, a lot of it is about just getting the right base information into the program. And certainly on land that the farm is managing, or the client is managing year on year, once you start to build up that database of information, it becomes a lot more useful. On short-term land or annual rents, that sort of thing, then obviously that's more of a challenge. But yeah, software is useful, but it needs to be simple. And if you could add, I think probably most of them you can actually, there's probably a fudge factor where you can make a small adjustment yourself, because you've observed sort of structure issue, which is an issue, or some other factor that might change the crop's nutrient requirement. I think going back to the other point about additional treatments, from a crop protection point of view, we're so used to having predictable outcomes to treatments that when we look at some of those treatments aimed at releasing nutrient or enhancing uptake, it doesn't seem as clear that we're getting predictable response. And where we've seen more rigorous examination of those, the response almost tends to be more likely on an underperforming crop than on a crop that is got everything it needs in terms of structure, moisture, nutrient. We perform well anyway. Which doesn't mean there isn't a place for them. It's just knowing where that place is in time to to make that intervention. So, you know, it's easy to dismiss them saying there isn't enough evidence, but it's all about confidence. Where do I use them? Which one do I use? It's an evolving area. I think we're still learning.
I'm going to pick up on another question, so I'll stay with you, Mark. So this is Herman Krabbers, who's based in the Netherlands, actually, asking about kind of whether you take account for application methods of manure. So the fact that different methods will lead to different levels of ammonia losses. So how you account for application method. And I guess to some extent, you know, RB209 accounts for that in terms of those availabilities. But whether you've got any comments on that, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, the addition of manures, soil amendments, whatever they might be, the bulky organic materials, it's always just, it's an added complication in terms of understanding what they contain and what proportion of that will actually be available to the crop. So, I mean, in line with the guidance broadly, the high readily available nitrogen materials we tend to incorporate as quickly as possible. And quite often the liquid wastes or liquid amendments might be either injected or trailing shoe onto the ground, so not thrown up in the air. The low readily available nitrogen materials, they probably tend to get spread and are less likely to be incorporated straight away. But then the nitrogen contribution from those is much less anyway. But you know, the sort of the pig and poultry waste and the liquid manures, we try to incorporate those within 24 hours and within 12 if we can. That's the general strategy to try and recover. But again, it's an estimate. You know, we might measure what's in there to start with. We don't measure what's available to the crop. So, you know, we do these things and then apply a sort of a percentage availability figure.
Yeah.
You know, and all those things make you tend to stay at the top end of the range of nutrient that you're looking at. I would suggest anyway, that's how we look at it.
Thanks for that, Mark. So Patrick's made another comment about I think the consideration for plant populations in the spring and estimated yield. Then he's gone on to ask about what's your view of variable rate technology based on soil mapping. So Ian, I don't know if you've got any comments on that, maybe from a P&K perspective.
Yes, I think variable rate, so like I say, varies probably a little bit by nutrient, but I think from a variable rate perspective, I think fundamentally variable rate seed is probably the starting point and probably the overriding point actually, and trying to achieve an even plant population probably negates then some of the benefits of variable rate technology later on. And so the more you can do early on to try and encourage a plant population which is more even across the field, and hopefully then optimal in those areas based on soil type, then probably the more you take away from the requirement to probably vary the nutrition. My other slight bugbear with variable rate over time has been the ability to measure for variable rate application has been beyond the ability to apply variable rate application, and of course that does come back a little bit to what method of application you're using, whether that's liquid or solid or whatever. But for a solid application to try and vary that much beyond the width of the spreading capability of the machine, or to come down narrower than the spreading capability of the machine, we can measure and assess variability to a much smaller scale than that, but then don't necessarily have the capability or the equipment to be able to apply at that sort of spatial level, really. So I think variable rate is something that we've worked with to various degrees over the last 10 to 12 years, and probably settled a little bit towards trying to ensure we have a plant population that's at the optimal level to try and remove some of the nutritional variability that we need to try and achieve in that way in the spring.
Yeah, that's great. I'll just ask one final question and then we'll wrap up, I think. I suppose it's been a complex season, hasn't it? The season that's just gone or just kind of finishing. I wondered whether you could kind of give any thoughts about, you know, what are your actual priorities now for thinking about planning as we look forward to the season ahead? What are the main things that you're going to be considering when you think about making those plans? And clearly, to some extent, you will have done that already. But yeah, Mark, I don't know if you want to kick off with a comment.
The main consideration, I think, on planning, I suppose, is really going to be about crop establishment and crop establishment conditions. And I think perhaps factoring those in more closely to how we might adjust the plan going forward. Obviously, there were spring crops in the project, as we said earlier. And we certainly did see a massive difference in terms of soil conditions and establishment this spring compared to last spring on spring crops, and that seems to be being reflected in crop performance and the nutrition of those crops. So I think, yeah, it's every season's different. There's still there's a lot can happen between now and when we start applying nitrogen in particular. So yeah, really looking at those establishment conditions, soil conditions, rooting capacity, that sort of thing. Those are going to be more of a consideration, I think, in the planning and application next spring.
Ian, from you?
Yeah, I think probably reflect Mark's comments a little bit really there in terms of how how we see the autumn now and how we get crops established over the autumn period is obviously going to be pretty critical to how we then see where our nutrition planning is going to go for the spring. I think talking openly, we've despite how well we tried to plan probably for 2025, we've certainly had lower yield delivery from crops than we would have liked, and so I think there is probably more scope this year to think about, again, thinking about nitrogen predominantly, but we've probably got more scope to think about, SMN and where that is going to sit in the spring. We've still got a winter to go through, obviously, as well. And if we get the balance of rain that we should have this year from what we've had in the spring, then we might not have any SMN left at all by the time we get to January. If we're going to get ourselves to average rainfall, which we're not. So yeah, I think there's more scope to think about SMN, I think, for next spring in terms of what has the implication of lower than expected yield versus a nitrogen application that was probably made for a slightly higher expectation because of the timing of application. That's something that we will definitely consider, I think, more for this coming spring.
Thank you. There were a couple of questions that came in. Just as I said, I was asking my final question, so I'm sorry we're not going to cover those, but I will not be tempted into asking you more questions and then probably overrunning. So yeah, thank you both for all those kind of comments and perspectives and being willing to share your opinions on that. We're really grateful for that. So yes, it leaves me just to kind of wrap up. So thank you very much for joining today. Just a few kind of signposting things from me. So please feel free to listen back to our previous webinars that are focused on the check and adjust and the review stages. They're on the NUTRI-CHECK-NET YouTube channel, and we'll signpost those in a follow-up email afterwards. I mentioned the platform that we have that contains our inventory of tools to support all 3 steps of management that's available on the platform. And finally, watch out for the release of our 20 best practices on the platform and website, which are really going to be what we consider as the key steps to plan, check and adjust and review. And that just leaves me to say thank you very much to everybody for joining, and I hope you've found it useful. And yes, you have a good rest of the day. Thank you very much.